So one of the first things I wanted to talk about was how these budget cuts and staffing reductions really kind of affected the modernization, the oversight over things like IT and OT.
We exited the pandemic and we're now into the modern era. We've seen a big shift across the industry. It doesn't matter if it's managed services to get that visibility and monitoring capability, or if it's testing services or even operational technology services. We're now outsourcing the operational side of the security program.
If the browser is the new endpoint, how should organizations rethink this security and monitoring with all these remote folks?
I have some smaller clients, right? They have compliance needs, but they don't have a huge IT team or a security team. And it was literally the first discussion that I had with the CEO of the organization. And they were coming to me with a discussion. Like, hey, wouldn't it be cheaper to just go with a model where I don't have to secure the devices, the organizations, and folks overseas that I onboard, and just interact with the data in a secure fashion via a browser? And the answer to that is, in a lot of cases, yes.
Why are attackers still going after third parties instead of hitting it directly?
Some of these enterprises on the planet have made it very, very expensive to go directly at them. So they've also looked at the ROI model, figured out how to make it extremely expensive and extremely time intensive, and kicked it over to something like a nation state or a very large cyber criminal group.
The attackers got really good at, attacking an organization, getting a implant, a web shell, just a straight up, interpreter, running on a exploited vulnerability and using that to load in their tools. We see that. We know what's not good. So once we start seeing that activity, we immediately start responding in the SOC. So our time to action got really, really quick. We could actually, jump on that. But what we saw the attackers immediately do is inherit some level of trust by starting to use commercially available tools. And, RMM is just the latest abused tool out there. Honestly, it doesn't matter who the vendor is.
Hi, in this Fireside chat today, we're going to discuss lessons from 2025 and how they're shaping cyber risk in 2026. Topics today include staffing pressure, the browser as a new attack surface, AI-driven risk, third-party exposure, and data exfiltration through legitimate tools. Attendees will leave with practical insights to help prioritize risk, strengthen security strategy in the year ahead. I'm Tim Armstrong. I'll be your moderator. With us, we have Rick McElroy and Jim Broome. Rick, do you want to give yourself an introduction, please?
Sure. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Rick McElroy, CEO of Nexasure, where we're really working with our clients to bring them into the modern age, both from a security and an IT perspective, and continue to drive their overall organizational risk down. I've been doing information security for the last 28 years. Boy, it's getting a little long in the tooth, Jim, for us to be doing this. But thanks, everybody, for being on today, and looking forward to talking about 2025 and some strategies that we can all think about in 26.
Hi, I'm Jim Broome. I'm president and CTO of DirectDefense, our cybersecurity services company specializing in penetration testing, managed services, OT, and compliance. So, and then more importantly, I get to work with everybody here on the call with me. So,
likewise. So we're going to start with our first topic. Welcome to the call, gentlemen. The first thing we want to bring up is economic pressure. What we saw over the year was a lot of budgets changing, staff reductions. We'll talk about how AI infected that. We'll talk about how AI impacted that.
That's a proper analogy with that.
So one of the first things I wanted to talk about was how these budget cuts and staffing reductions really kind of affected the modernization, the oversight over things like IT and OT. I've seen that like a lot of organizations don't have the internal either tooling or staff to operate this stuff, either because they've cut folks or because the technology has changed and gotten more complicated, or, it's always evolving. And as a result of this, a lot of places either sort of failed because of that or lost, some of the internal, capabilities they had. But they also lost their ability to just respond quickly. And so what we've seen is that folks are largely moving this data outside, or moving this responsibility outside of the organization, and starting to lean more on MSSPs and the like, because they kind of have to. We think this is here to stay, but Jim, as these security teams shrink and the budgets tighten, what are organizations most at risk of losing? Visibility, control? What's your opinion?
Short answer is all the above. Longer answer is, like Rick, tried to tease me there with my age at this point, which is I have the benefit of doing this for, well over 30 years at this point. So been around the block once or twice. And so if I just put my short lens on, as we exited the pandemic and we're now into the modern era, our challenges that we've seen across the board for customers is really dealing with, how do you move forward? How do you operationalize? So you kind of hit the nail on the head, which is we've seen a big shift to across the industry. It doesn't matter if it's managed services to get that visibility and monitoring capability, or if it's testing services or even operational technology services. We're now outsourcing the operational side of the security program, however mature or lack of maturity the organization is from that perspective of we just need to cover and get our basic stuff done. And so that's where we've definitely seen the benefit on, where service companies like ourselves and others out there provide that value to customers to give them a tangible outcome of, keeping the lights on, literally in some cases, testing products at scale for organizations, or just more simplistically, really just providing that core value while their existing headcount is allowed to shift and focus on helping a CISO, helping the business from a business strategy and execute on strategy. We saw that momentum start in the pandemic, and it's pretty much carried forward, if not accelerated, in the past 24 months, especially with all the different things going on in the world from both a global economy standpoint, but also just a regional or state level, or literally your own company, and how you're actually getting compression throughout your ecosystem and your budgeting. So
yeah, and it's got to be easier to be able to find an expert when you're sort of outsourcing than to try to hire.
You would hope so.
Hey, Rick, as you've seen this happen, as the outsourcing becomes more common, how do organizations make sure that they're not just shifting cost for they're lowering cost, but yet getting a inferior service?
Yeah, well, I think this is something we're all going to have to rethink as it comes to maturity and contractual obligations, right? So it would be fair to say that when MSSP started, we didn't know enough on our side of the house as CISOs, and they probably didn't know enough as well. I think back to my early experience with Counterpane as an example. One of the first MSSPs that was out there, I think I had an unrealistic expectation. So I thought things contractually should have been handled, but fast forward 15, 20 years, we've spent an inordinate amount of work around that, right? So I would say things that can be achieved in your security program by looking to an external vendor, continuity in the program. It's very hard in certain regions. There's only so many CISOs. I know here in San Diego, I know all of them. We have a tendency to move around the same types of gigs, and people move in and out of the market, right? So if I think about continuity from a leadership perspective, sometimes going with a long-term contract to an advisory firm or a vCISO firm is very helpful as we set that strategic direction and march down that road. So the last thing I'll say about this is, and it's going to dovetail into another topic that we've got geared up today, which is really around your supply chain and third-party management. So if I am choosing to send my operations over the fence, well, I've got to increase the amount of validation and vetting that I do up front. I've got to make sure that the company is healthy, that they're growing, that they do have the ability to recruit and those things, because you don't want to get in a situation where the needs of your team and your organization have outgrown them. So I think those are just some brief considerations to think about, but we've got to get pretty good and laser focused around their deliverables. If we do that and give them, pay to play type contracts, i.e. I expect this in 3 months, I expect it in 6, or I will make a change. I think the vendors are doing their honest, job in trying to meet those things. But I think there is a bit of maturity on the organization side as it comes to, managing this relationship that we'll need to see.
Are there things that shouldn't leave the organization? We were talking about like outsourcing or bringing in, folks like Jim to look at these organizations and to add a level of expertise around these things. But are there things that really just need to stay inside of the organization?
I used to make that argument. I mean, if you listen to some of my early talks back in the early 2000s, clearly there were things that we were waiting for maturity. out of some of the vendor community and the managed service providers. I mean, they were frankly building an entire practice around something like network detection or something like taking all of your Cisco logs and being able to make sense of those things, right? And so again, I think that comes back to maturity. I think it comes back to, really thinking that through for your organization. But we've made progress on that front, right? So I think my general thoughts there are, again, you're building a certain level of trust with an organization. Probably start off small. One of the things we see all the time, and, I'm sure Jim would say the same, is it's pretty typical. Someone says, I need better data. I'm not getting enough data. I don't know what my vulnerability status is. So the start may become a very tactical effort, but I think as the external advisors, if you attach that strategically to the business outcomes that are needed, you're able to continue to grow not only your business on the external side, but make sure you're delivering for that client internally and not getting out over your skis saying, hey, we can deliver on a bunch of stuff that we can't actually prove. Again, if the client is doing their job contractually, and requiring, certain metrics, certain performance metrics, those things, and they're based in the contract, well, I can assure you people will try to get paid and meet the outline of the contract. Right. And so again, I think as you build trust, how is trust built in business? That's going to be contractually, making sure that you're not giving them unrealistic OLAs or SLAs to adhere to. But look, we've got clients that do everything from full managed infrastructure to infrastructure in the cloud. So I would say I don't have a definitive around what shouldn't lead your organization. Again, that's going to be based around the risk appetite that you have as a leadership team.
Yeah, I'd actually, double click on that as well, which is, really today the customers are trying to find that visibility story for themselves or the operational, I'm getting what I'm paying for, ROI, just a true visibility that actually has a tangible outcome. If anything, I would say, to segue back to compliance and governance these days, it's data security governance that's actually kind of driving the what doesn't leave the organization or what stays in the continental U.S. respectively of U.S. law or globally with global law. That's really the biggest decision-making thing we see today is really, hey, but just got through 2 contracts this morning where the organization deals with like healthcare data and they need to guarantee that it's only stored in everything that, they're using SaaS solutions. It has to be in the continental US. It can't leave the continental US because of HIPAA, as a simple example. So, they are still outsourcing. They're looking for a tangible end outcome from this product that they're working with, but they have to go through the entire supply chain of all the underneath the cool little metric, the thing that makes the graph and this little component that does this and this that sends that. It all stays in the US. So, kind of going back to the secure build of the materials all the way to ecosystem of how the thing works, making sure that it actually stays in those refined geographic areas, from a governance standpoint. And even to double click on, Rick hit the nail on the head of what was okay a decade or is just simply 5 years ago is no longer okay. And I can easily point to managed security services. When we, as DirectDefense started, literally it was okay to simply go to market with, I got a really world's best service for you. I'm going to give you all this custom stuff. And really all of our SLAs and metric were around, you sent me 10,000, I answered 10,000, or you can chew me out for only answering 9,991. So, where's the extra 9? Where's why did this miss? Now that same conversation happens as a bare minimum of expectation of service. On top of that, we now have all the time to detect, time to respond, time to enrich, time to act, all those, microsecond to second to, conversations and ecosystems and the expected dashboard. Literally we were laughing the other day because when we got done, we had really spent some time re-architecting just how the data flows through our SOC, and looking for gates to actually be able to start calculating a lot of these, expectations of a secure maturity program, which is, we have to report on nearly 15 stats now. It wasn't you sent me X and we did Y. That's just, now we have to add on all the extra widgets because essentially there's terms of service. There's minimal expectations moving forward that have matured. So the industry is maturing at the same rate of our customers sometimes. Depending on the pendulum, it may be one side or the other. And so that's kind of really where we're seeing the biggest, education for both parties. Some customers come to us very mature and they make us rise our game. But in many cases, we're actually doing the opposite direction, which is just telling users today, here's what you should minimally be expecting now.
So, Jim, on that point, with outsourcing to different groups and things like that, how can CISOs measure if it's effective? How can they, quantify and measure that and talk to the board and things when they have internal teams and external teams?
Honestly, I do this all the time, which is phone a friend. Recommend they actually talk to another CISO, like, hey, what services are you getting? What type of quality of reporting are you getting? What type of metrics are you getting? So you actually know what you're coming into the conversation more informed. A lot of them still have the legacy expectation of, I sent you this, you gave me that. And they're not expecting it, more enhanced visibility story or more enhanced response story. Or, sometimes you get the other side of the equation, which is they're well over their skis and the expectation is I'm going to get all of this. And reality is you might get some of that. It might go a little anemic in certain areas. So it's really an education of kind of coming up to speed on what's the current trends, where's the industry going. One of the common cases I go through time and time again, and not the vendor bash or anything like that, which is, legacy vendors are not the new it anymore. So specifically using Splunk as the example, have customers that have legacy investment in Splunk and, a Splunk implementation, it's an excellent log management platform. The challenge is the story around what the SIM provides and what the other ecosystem of products provide to that now. You really start classing yourself into a different expectation. Like, I'm going to maintain this Splunk implementation, and you wind up not being able to talk to the new vendors of the world with their method and their service level because they don't pick up that legacy platform or they don't work with that legacy platform. So again, it's more of an education expectation of just expect, and, look for your outcomes. I like to tease a lot simply because, I know my service and one of the reasons we decided to make ourselves different. And so I literally, educate each customer I talk to, which is, before you let us do any of our demos as an MSSP MDR provider, simply ask us all this, 3 simple questions. Will you give me a custom alert? Will you triage that alert in a custom fashion? And when you actually respond in a custom fashion? Just by asking those 3 simple questions and level the playing field, you'll actually find out even today, you'll eliminate, if you put 10 of us in the room, you'll actually eliminate 6 to 7 of us, just by simply asking those 3 basic questions, because that's the disparity in terms of services today. And so again, buyer beware, be aware of what you want as an outcome and make an informed decision from there.
That makes sense. So I just want to cover some quick actionable takeaways from this first discussion. It sounds like the obligation to operate and measure is really not any different than it's ever been, but it sounds like there's some more specificity required in this, and what you're expected to give has risen. We see outsource rising. Organizations have to demand quality from these third parties. Is that what your experiences are as well?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things I was thinking about, while Jim was talking, is really the ad hoc nature that occurs when you have external advisors advising an organization. The big 5 have sort of, they all kind of follow the playbook of each one of them with a little bit of, flavor in there. But I think, it's one of the big challenges that I see delivering, external advice is there's no programmatic approach to this. If you swap me in for another vCISO, that vCISO may have a completely different way that they work, that they calculate things like risk, all of those things. And so I think for me, looking at that programmatic approach, how do we start to anchor in good data? What are those data types that are needed to present back things like vulnerability information, your latest pen testing reports, some type of GRC light to do issue tracking and risk tracking in the org. And so that's what I've seen, folks like DirectDefense that are kind of differentiating themselves in the market doing is anchoring around that programmatic approach to delivering external advisory. And that has a couple of impacts to the org. If you swap in another advisor from your external advisory team, they should follow a similar approach, and your continuity shouldn't change that much. Secondarily, when you think about things like liability and negligence as it results to decisions being made inside of an org for risk and security, in my humble opinion, if you're not taking a very programmatic approach to that, you're going to run into some issues as it relates to lawsuits and when folks try to find who's actually at fault for, what happened in the environment. So a little bit on our side, I think the vCISOs and advisories need to mature a bit and really start looking at that programmatic approach. But again, I think that'll give you an anchor in the type of metrics you should look for and that continuity and resilience of the leadership in your security program.
So we're going to move on to our new topic now, which is the browser in the workforce being the new attack surface. The browser is effectively now the new endpoint, especially with all these folks working from home, hybrid workers everywhere. Organizations are struggling to maintain visibility into what the employees are doing, what they're running, what plugins they're using, and especially how they're using AI. The traditional controls really just aren't built to handle this. And this is, from what I've seen, driving a new focus on things like zero trust, visibility, kind of like what's old becomes new again. So Rick, if the browser is the new endpoint, how should organizations rethink this security and monitoring with all these remote folks?
Yeah, not to be a little bit flippant, but I think back to the early days of browsers, and they were literally the Achilles heels for most organizations. When you think back to, early Internet Explorer as an example, right? So that's a journey that we've been on to, I think, start to secure those things. I mean, I remember, Dan Kaminsky doing a talk on this topic at DEF CON. It must have been 15 years ago, right? I mean, forgive me if I get that wrong. Yeah, but you're not wrong, right? It's interesting to me. I have some smaller clients, right? So folks that don't have, they have compliance needs, but they don't have a huge IT team or a security team. And it was literally the first discussion that I had with the CEO of the organization. And they were coming to me with a discussion like, hey, wouldn't it be cheaper to just go with a model where I don't have to secure the devices, the organizations, and folks overseas that I onboard can just interact with the data in a secure fashion via a browser? And the answer to that is, in a lot of cases, yes, right? So I can't say that as a prescription. However, when you start to add up the cost of, again, MDM, managing endpoint detection or response, heck, even password resets, all of this stuff, at least from an overall management perspective, becomes a little easier. So again, those are considerations that I think we have to have. What's the impact to the IT team managing this? Can they even manage another control that we bring in? So I do think, it is a good line of delineation to draw for defense. Now, that being said, you are going to need some technology here. There are a bunch of things you can do to thin out that attack surface inside of your environment today. There's certainly some nice open source plugins to look at things like, people that are using open source language models out there to get you a little bit of that telemetry to know about. But frankly speaking, I think it is something that folks should look at least from an architecture perspective in 26, because I kind of see a future where it's going that direction and the browser really becomes our middleware for, thin compute again, if you will, right?
Yep, like the old dumb terminals. Jim, what do you think about this? Is it? Are you concurring with Rick? And what blind spots does that provide for you and for organizations? Things like plugins and AI and all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's a bigger question. Number one, why did the bad guy get in? But number two is, what did my employee do with my data while working from home? And so our number two ask is actually HR related today when it comes to forensic investigations, which is to look for signs of intellectual property theft, look for signs of data handling misuse because the employee is no longer in the traditional confines of a building. We've got data coming in from cloud sources that hopefully have good audit. We have legacy, file storage that we're still dealing with. That's still the pile of, the Z drive with a pile of files out there that's been out there for 30 years. We inherit that liability when we allow everybody to access it from everywhere. And so if I take that focus, that visibility or the lack thereof, and just take that story, which is if the employer can't see what's doing it, we also can't see what the employee is doing and how they're actually going about their day, because employees do drive innovation. They are going to tell you and dictate how they're going to interact with your data and how they're going to function for your company, as they grow. And so we have this constant problem of shadow IT. Sometimes we see it remote management tools and the outsourcing of MSP or IT functions. But even today with the employees, it's, do they have Fathom installed to, take notes on the calls that I'm on? Do I have, am I using Claude or one of the other, implementations to just, write it and automate some of my daily tasks, those type of things? You're leaking your data all over the place. So getting the visibility story on who you're interacting with, who's allowed to make those decisions on behalf of the business. So I kind of go back to, you even have an AI policy, thou shall do the following things and only these things. Or did you invest in AI today, which could be as simple as, swiping the credit card over at Microsoft or over at Google and getting your corporate enterprise tenant. So that at least that you're doing your best operationally to capture the data and keep it inside the organization. These are all larger, policy procedure questions. From a tooling standpoint, there's a rash of tools coming out. Trust me. Some of them are simply as simple as ZTNA, which is, really not so much what is the employee doing or where they're going. And, from a home and content standpoint, it's just simply how the data is being used and where we can actually see data, running out to an open AI API or something like that. So you can make policy decisions on how people use known AI apps just by having that visibility story. To now we are actually seeing, browser plugins to look for other browser plugins to see what's going on at the asset level. So, it's very new. I can't give you a clear, definitive answer on which technology is going to be best, but it is going to be a defense in depth strategy, which is, mix a little bit of, ZTNA, pick your vendor, that works for you to get that visibility of what employees are doing from work from home. And again, it's not policy enforcement. It's just visibility. What you choose to do with it, that's a different story. But the secondary aspect of that is just being aware of, what are people installing on apps and how can we control the app? And so that comes back to, we had this conversation for nearly 20 years, which is, does my employee need admin access on their laptop? Yes or no? We've unilaterally said no. But somehow, some way, because it works in user space, browser plugins just work. They just get installed and they keep going. They exempt themselves of the decision-making process. So that's where we've seen the rise of specific vendors using Island as an example, where we're now going back to corporate secure browsers that, we can at least do patch management and configuration baselining across the board in the organization. So it's going to be a mixture of those two solutions. I mean, to their credit, Microsoft is coming out with their ecosystem built around Edge, go figure. And then you've got other vendors coming up with, more open frameworks, but, it is going to be that, yin and yang of technology or, a mix of technology that we're going to see here in the next year or so.
So we're still at the same place where we're trying to balance productivity and security so employees don't lose their minds.
Yes, I mean my analogy still stands up. So if it's convenient, it's not secure. So let's just go ahead and just really be simplistic about it. Is there no one built security in the ecosystem for you to just hand out a business card, but think about the damage I could do with your business card.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously with a lot of this comes all sorts of employee training. But I've heard for years, and maybe Rick, you can speak about this. Why can't we rely on the employees to make good decisions here? Why can't we, trust that they'll know that it's a phishing email or that the plugin is malicious or what have you?
Yeah, well, a couple of things here. They have gotten better about clicking on things, right? So to be fair, it's not 100% click through rate in most orgs. However, I do think that users are fatigued. Like what I hear directly from folks is they are fatigued. The training isn't dynamic enough to intrigue them to take the next training. We haven't gotten to the point where we're doing inline coaching or training as people are handling the activities. So I see this as like a key area where language models can actually, help here, right? So I'm a user, I'm doing something. It would be great to interrupt them just briefly and give them some information at that point of click, at that point of send, whatever the case may be. Because I find usually if users have 30 seconds to a minute to just have a brief pause, they're probably going to make the right decision. If people are rushed, if They're under some sort of external pressure, whether it's real or forced by a social engineering team. They're going to do those things. So I think we need to rethink how we're training, not only how we're training, but we're not quite caught up on the threats of today, right? So we're still telling users that most of these threats are going to come through your email. If we don't start changing that in 2026 to things like text messaging, Messenger, WhatsApp, Signal, Teams, Slack, what we refer to as business communications compromise, well, organizations are still going to have a bad time, right? And so I think my external advisory and educator mind goes towards, well, what are other people doing to highly educate people on topics, right? So I think we don't have to invent the wheel here. We get a lot of learnings from our learning and development departments, from our training departments. So I would say we need to go consult with these folks on, modernizing how we're actually doing this. And frankly speaking, on the product front, they're going to have a bit of a catch up, right? And I'm thinking about two of the specific vendors that are out there. There's been a couple developed, in this sort of era of AI, which I have a tendency to lean a little bit more because they've got some of that, inline training features. But yeah, I think for organizations, the big thing is start revamping now. My tactical advice for folks is start to treat some teams as very high risk. Your accounting team, your executive team are clearly under threat, and they're spending money on executive security now. This is a great education opportunity. And let's not fatigue the users, right? So we have to go back and push back a little bit on compliance, on things like, I have to do an hour of annual training once. Why do I need to do that? Why can't I sit through 12 5-minute sessions once a month, like over distinct, very small efforts? You don't fatigue the users. You don't bore them. And if we start to, my last rant on this, if we start to do something like gamification of our education programs, well, now I've got users who want to contribute, who want to put in on that. But I think largely we're just pushing a bunch of information, expecting them to remember it. And that's probably never going to work. And I apologize for the very long rant about security education, but it's time.
Actually,
we do something.
Actually, I'll even I'll double down with you. I'll give you a pop quiz. Name the two classes of employees that are exempt of all your acceptable use training.
We know one is
payable and HR. Accounts payable and HR. It's their very job to click on everything that comes through to them to make sure that bills get paid and they look at new employees.
Yep. Jim, that's a great point. We also tell users to click, and then we've got a generation of very young people coming into the workforce that have been trained to click their entire lives. My premise is users are going to click on things. We should do better about detection and prevention at point of click, and then give them, again, that education that intrigues them enough to go, this is personally relevant to my life and it's professionally relevant. That's why I care.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it seems like the real takeaways on this are that, you still can't rely on employees as your last line of defense, but it's still just as important as ever to make sure that they're educated on these, and especially these new types of scams, deep fakes, AI stuff like that. The other takeaway I heard there was really thinking about your technology in terms of zero trust and implementations of that, as well as having an AI policies. To Jim's point, I think earlier, I don't know that a lot of folks even do.
It's surprising.
If they're regulated,
I'll just leave it at that. Yeah, some people do. Yeah. I don't have a percentage yet, but it's surprising because it's an easy thing to start with, AI governance.
Yeah. On that topic, with AI kind of coming in everywhere, I've seen, and I've used myself, things like, coding AIs and things of that nature. And over the course of the year, we saw a lot of folks either letting staff go or sort of reorganizing who was where. And based on that, are we seeing are we seeing the benefits of having put that AI into place, Jim, or is it, are we just keep moving the proverbial shell to the other side? What do you think there?
I mean, as an employer, if I put my employer hat on for a second here, is like, yes, we are looking for tangible outcomes that, don't need to sleep, don't need to get fed other than the utility bill, and just, operate 24/7, 365. So we're all questing for that, nirvana moment or utopian environment at the moment. And if we just kind of simply go back to the premise of AI, which is we're trying to synthesize a human experience. So, I tease today because when I'm talking to like my folks and other folks that are not, nerds, tech related, and you're like, what is the concept of AI? It's like you're trying to take someone directly out of college that has a breadth of knowledge, but is not an expert in anything, and give them a trainable job. And so this is how you go about training them and going about these things. So are we seeing the benefit of AI across the board? Short answer is yes. But, to the earlier part of, what about your maturity? What is the expected quality coming out of those platforms? And so that question is currently getting answered the hard way, which is, what is the quality of the result of investments in AI today? I know the industry got a double dose this past year of reductions because of AI, or at least that was the reason officially acknowledged. Or even CEOs publicly thumping their chest saying, hey, 30 to 50% of my code base is now developed by AI. What they've neglected to actually hit up on is what was the outcome of that effort, which is, you reduced your staff because you had this 30 to 50% of development. The downside is now you had to staff up 400, in some cases I've heard as high as 1,200% on quality assurance, because the good news is it's just like a human. The bad news is it's producing the same quality a human does with more volume and doesn't sleep. So we've created this tidal wave of vulnerabilities and, just bad code or non-working, non-functional code that wouldn't pass a QA process that is still largely a human, validation, either from QA, from quality assurance on just pure functionality to the security side of that. I doubled down with Veracode, did a really good research. They went and pulled roughly 100 apps they knew was developed by AI, and 45% of them actually all came back with OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities. Good news is that's just like a human. That's about the average what a human produces, is anywhere from 40 to 50%. So again, good news is, we've come very close to the human experience when it comes to, I'll give Claude their due. Claude and so forth, the developing the code out there develops just as good and or poorly as a human does today. The downside is they don't sleep and they don't eat. So they're constantly pumping out, tons and tons of new vulns, old vulns, and, really, just a whole tidal wave. And, teasingly, not to go too far off the topic, but now we've gone even one extra step, which is, again, sticking with the human theme. Claude has been found to be self-reliant, and there's a couple of scenarios out there where Claude tried to, get someone fired to reinforce its point of view. And some of the sample cases they gave and, outside of cyber. But directly today, we're asking AI to produce code and then go do a security check against the code that it just actually put into the platform. And so teasingly, it's saying the code's good. And yet this is the same code that a dedicated security vendor went and found flaws in and had to, report that, hey, the code that is saying is all good. We're still consistently finding flaws in there. So we've got a scale problem, which is really the biggest takeaway today is, we're generating a ton of output. And right now we're still relying on legacy injects from, static code analysis tools within the development cycle to, humans actually doing the testing. And so we've seen the shift of employment over here shift dramatically to the employment in the upper side of the chain of dealing with QA and the outcomes of this new deluge of content coming at us.
What do you like? What are the guardrails we'd put on that to kind of minimize the damage there?
Test, baby, test. I mean, at this point, it's really going to be, that simplistic, which is we can't trust. There is no level of inherited trust today in what AI is saying is good. If we can go back and use manual testing mechanisms or even automated testing mechanisms with the human behind it and still find fault. Right now, we're only solving for the programmatic coding mistakes, which is what OWASP top 10, 8 out of 10 of them actually are just bad code, bad mistakes in coding. What we're not solving is logic flaws, which I'm going to, go on a wild hair and say there's probably, a tenfold increase in logic flaws that we're going to see as a byproduct of, this development effort. So even if we solve the basic coding as a bad error mistake for OWASP top 10 vulns, we still have a whole series of tests that haven't been, rationalized without human, basically bad intent included into the design and testing of the platform.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. And I would imagine too that in replacing, a majority of your junior staff with an AI, you end up with a future problem. Rick, you and I talked about this a little bit. Like, how do you deal with that? AI sort of takes away that junior dev. How do you deal with that in the future when, like, to Jim's point, you need somebody more senior to look at that code?
Yeah, well, I think about, my path into security engineering and architecture and leadership. I was a junior. I had no idea what I was doing. I had some good mentors. I had good books. I had good training, and you start to build on that. So maybe you get a competency in something like network security because I deployed 5,000 firewalls, whatever the case may be, right? Could be endpoint security. It doesn't really matter the control that you go after, but you build, I think, wisdom over time, right? And so for me, there are ways to close this wisdom gap. However, when I see a lot of the solutions folks are working on internally, or even some of the vendors, cool. It's like, well, where'd you get this pile of data to train this particular model? Because frankly speaking, if you took, a month and you have a tiny data set, I have a little bit of distrust that that's going to drive itself towards, a sense of truth. Right. So I do see, to Jim's earlier point, we're going to need to increase, and chances are someone's working on it now. I just don't know about it. There's going to be QA AI, right, that is able to do this stuff at scale as an organization is, pumping out all of this code. But yeah, I think those are the big things that I think about. And specific with security engineers, it's really hard to get to a place where you can threat hunt with an environment if I have a lack of understanding of an operating system. If I had a lack of understanding of what the adversaries are actually doing in that operating system to do things like credential harvesting and pivots and all of that good stuff, right? I know for most of us, threat hunting didn't even become a thing in our industry for almost 30 years. If we go back to the 60s and count that, it's 50 years. But, so I think about the collective wisdom as a industry we had to build to do that, and the mechanisms to do that. Threat exchanges, heck, we didn't even have standardized ways to do threat intel exchanges. We had to, not just us, but lots of people invented that, right? And so that's the journey that I think we're on. I think we just have to consider it in a world where everything happens at machine speed. The other big thing I think about is, great. I can kludge some things together today with existing language models or my own model to do some of this information. However, I've heard this directly from teams who have developed solutions. They start to do things that were unintended. And I'll give you an example. A friend of mine told me a story. Essentially, they had a partial AI solution that would talk to another AI. The job of this other AI was to go get one data set. Right. So they were attempting to look at something like vuln plus current status inside of an ITSM system to go like, hey, is this being fixed? Or, it's a simple question. All of a sudden, this fetcher started to log into all kinds of things that it wasn't supposed to. So now the security team's like, well, wait a second, this thing's escalating privileges and logging in to get access to data set. So now they had to kind of start over from scratch. Right. So yes, we are going to go through these things, but I think there's a way to beta and prototype that in non-production, frankly speaking. I don't know what happened to we promote things into production in this AI era. I don't think anything changes there from a risk or change management perspective. It's just we're kind of moving as fast as we can, which is bad. The whole point of, change in configuration management is to just slow things down a bit to make sure that we aren't introducing these massive changes. So
yeah, sanity checks.
It's literally stop, drop, and roll. Think about it for a second. Or do we really want to do that? My best example of in that scenario is really just, I go back to logic flaws of you gotta, at some point we're gonna have to train an evil AI. And what if it decides to break out? That's your sci-fi story, but realistically, logic flaws are literally abuse of function. I can go back to the early days of white hat security and, Jeremiah up on the stage at Black Hat doing the get rich and die trying on, there's the early time inside of eBay, where it would actually present you with the person that you were, competing against in the last 5 minutes. And so basically they came up with a mechanism of abusing the function of password resets. They would give you the name of the person competing with you and their email address. So you just open up a browser and log in and out with them with just a generic password and lock them out. So they would no longer be allowed to compete against you, and you'd wind up getting the product at the price you wanted. So as an outcome of that, that's just an abusive function. It's a logic flaw. But as an outcome of that, eBay immediately went and suspended, that process. Is you can't, can't go through that mechanism anymore. And so teasingly, the byproduct of that was they now created a window for 5 minutes that you could brute force any account in the platform if they were actively, competing for a bid. I'm paid to think evil thoughts. And so how can I abuse this functionality and do something that wasn't never intended to? And I can give you dozens of examples today and other platforms, but that's the level we're going to have to get to automate testing at scale beyond just purely coding mistakes. And right. No.
So instead of looking at, OWASP top 10, we need to look further at, if I exploit this vulnerability, that gives me access to that.
By all means, please solve coding mistakes, which is OWASP top 10. That's all as a global industry. Let's try to go fix that problem. We've been working on it for a few decades now, but hopefully we're getting there. But at the same time even after we're done with that, you're still going to wind up with still another series of vulnerabilities that just interacting with the output that have to be solutioned. And so we still do with that day in and day out. We find the most they're humorous to us when we said I guess no one really thought about doing this, but what the hell, let's throw 3,000 characters at a zip code and see what happens. I mean, that's literally what dynamic app testing is. And so it's those type of thought processes that are going to have to be actually institutionalized in a system and scale that needs to work and grow. So
doesn't that, maybe Rick, if you want to chime in on this, doesn't that add a ton of tech debt potentially too? And hidden vulnerabilities because you're not doing things the way that a human maybe would.
Yeah. Well, in a lot of cases we have generally stopped some bleeding, right? Especially for, orgs that have been on a 10, 15 year maturity, cycle with something like app security, right?
Yeah, it doesn't work with AI.
Yeah, so they're doing code checks. They're checking it into central repository. They're doing good. Hopefully, usually they are doing a fairly good job of making sure people can't get to that IP, right?
Yep.
And the other thing in an AI era is, again, I told you about the data issue and kind of training that. So what? I just give it access to every single file in my organization. Well, where are those files? So even if I think about something like wisdom management, right? So I want team wisdom management. To your point, Tim, how do I train junior people and still make sure they become senior? Well, I've got to exchange, this wisdom of what is normal in our business? How is that extracted? How do I exchange that with another human so that they can do my job at 2 a.m. so I don't have to? So those are the challenges that I kind of see, but I also think about, to our earlier point, we already have existing processes that account for this stuff. The real issue is, I think, the speed at which the business wants to realize the value of AI, right? So much like when the business wanted to realize the value of being on their own devices or sending data to the cloud because it's cheaper, it's our job to manage that risk, to inform them of the risk, and hopefully not slow it down in a way that obviously can't achieve business objectives, but in the right possible sense that we drive the overall risk of doing that. Because after all, if we rush that to market, that can have some pretty major impacts on the org and, their bottom line, right? So that's all we're trying to do is just advise and make sure that we've got some good controls in place. We've got some good checks. And, frankly speaking, I think we're, to your point about legacy tech stacks, there's a whole lot of things that were built from attacks 5 years ago, 10 years ago. They're not really built to keep up with these types of attacks that'll come from the offensive side. So we're going to be in this kind of period where we're going to have a bunch of legacy stuff. We're going to introduce a whole lot of new change into the organization. We need some methodologies to normalize that. But I don't see legacy code going anywhere anytime soon. I mean, even if you think about who's the number one vendor in the IT ticketing space, highly doubt that we see a new version of that code for a while. I mean, I know people over there, I know what they're working on. But I can mention that out of a bunch of security vendors too. Probably won't see a huge fork of, CrowdStrike code, lifted into, this modernization effort, right? So it's just what it is for security professionals. And that's the job of the advisory team. And I think your external team, to your point, Tim, what are things you can pick up from having an external advisory team? We pay attention to all of this stuff. So then when you have questions about, well, who is doing something cool in this space? Who's actually providing value? You don't have to go spend hours doing that research. We do that research for you and, deliver that in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, and I can just imagine, in especially smaller orgs, trying to keep up with the pacing of these changes is just probably impossible. So
it is impossible. And I know because we're picking up more clients. And when I ask them, why are we picking up more clients? It's your intelligence and wisdom on these two topics. Where can my business go from an AI perspective, and how can it be secure or as risk-free as possible? Those are the two conversations I have with CEOs almost on a weekly basis. The rest of it, frankly speaking, from their perspective, doesn't matter.
Yep. Totally agree.
Yep. Cool. Well, let's move to a new topic. I think it's pretty relevant. Third-party risk seems to be have really kind of come into the forefront over the last several years, maybe more. We all heard the story of how folks got in through a third party into Target. That was kind of a shining example of it. But like when these organizations have improved defenses with things like EDR, people are still getting in. They're still using the cheapest path in. There's an idea of attack cost that I heard years ago that still seems to be very relevant. These third party vendors, they often have much less of a security budget than the organizations that they're protecting. They're not security focused. And these high profile things, the pipeline, for example, that, they shut down, maybe not because of their systems being affected and infected, but it was severe enough that they did shut the whole business down for a number of days. Why are attackers still going after third parties instead of hitting it directly, Rick?
Well, one, let's give ourselves a big pat on the back as security professionals and security teams. In a lot of cases, we box them into a corner, right? Frankly speaking, some of these enterprises on the planet have made it very, very expensive to go directly at them, right? So they've also looked at the ROI model, figured out how to make it extremely expensive and extremely time intensive, and kicked it over to something like a nation state or a very large cyber criminal group. And so it's like they've gotten rid of the low hanging, fruit, all of that stuff. So in some ways, even the invention of, EDR as a market opened up lots of telemetry. People didn't know what was happening, right? So good for us. We continue to invent. We continue to cultivate this data and contextualize it in a way that reveals what's happening in our environment. Secondly, I would say the one area where I'm still disappointed from an internal intel is business normal. This is still a very hard problem, especially as an external advisor. So I'd love to see someone out there take a swing at what they're doing for, business normal and exchanging this. And like, what does SCCM look like in an environment? Oh, it looks like an APT sometimes. I don't want to waste time on that stuff, right? Right. So kudos to us. We've obviously increased defenses. We've spent a bunch of money. We've got some highly trained people. But what becomes my Achilles heel? Well, my third parties, but not only my third parties, and this is something we'll probably start to hear more about this year, my third parties. And this is something no one has visibility into because I've spoken to a whole lot of very large organizations. At most, we're doing some sort of vetting over tier one providers. So that might be a critical infrastructure provider. That may be a critical security provider that we've asked for a SOC type 2. We've done some sort of security scorecard. I mean, these are, we've exchanged 300 questions on an Excel spreadsheet. We're still doing these things, right? But this idea of the intelligence that can be gathered, and it's not just security relevant, right? So I want to be clear about this. The pandemic for a lot of organizations represented their first time they really cared about this. Why did they really care? Well, you had organizations who couldn't produce baby food. Why could, so they start to look through their supply chain from a business operations perspective and a perspective of delivering that out to, the wider consumer market, national security interests are in play here, all of these things. And so I think we're going to need a little bit of a technology leap and innovation on that side, frankly speaking. The current vendors, and there are a couple of good ones that are now able to cluster third parties together. Great. Yep. So I'm starting to see a shared ecosystem around this intelligence from third parties that we can build on, that we can use, all of these things. But what I'd like to see is a co-business and, risk effort here, right? Because it's not just a ramification of like this system gets hacked and then we get hacked. No, if this system goes down, I can't deliver to my customers. This needs to be mapped from a BIA, from a business impact perspective. I need to account for it when it comes to contracts so that I can, ensure that there's, some sort of clause in there that in the event that this happens, what are the comms? What are all of the things? And frankly speaking, it's largely being driven out of, our risk teams and, GRC teams and folks like that. But I'd like to see a little bit of a, Venn diagram where the center has us, risk and the business at the same conversation. And then we're probably going to have to fill that in with some new tooling to gather that data. But yeah, that's my big take on that too.
Yeah. Jim, how would organizations start to assess this risk though? Like if you're talking at maybe a board level, how about what you're doing as a CISO, how do you assess the third parties in a way that makes sense? And, to that point, how would we start to assess the third parties, the sort of nth party risk that's lying beyond that?
Honestly, Rick hit the nail on the head. Contracts. Hey, so, it's an actual contract vehicle, to choose to work with your partners and integrate with them over time. You both have a vested interest. You kind of need to come up with the simple terms of, conditions with each other on what's acceptable to you. Do we actually meet at the middle? Do I have a 90-day, patching cycle and you're still rocking a 6-month patching cycle? That's a business conversation to be had, especially when we're talking about, uptime, availability, how your ecosystem impacts my ecosystem, and really just sit down at the end of the day and it's like, how can you guarantee you're going to, take care of my business as much as, if not more than I do. That is your terms of service. Those are your contracts that you work with. And really it comes to different frameworks that, third party vendor management, to actually having policy and procedures, the simple ones. We talked about AI a lot, at this point, but yeah, teasingly, first thing I tell everybody is whatever solution you're looking, to look at first, step one, do they have a SOC 2? The answer is no, then move on, find the next one. That's a bare minimum expectation I have. And I'll be the first to tell you, SOC 2 does not equate security. It just means they can keep it running. So, I'm looking for someone that can actually keep their servers running 99.99. And so just getting that level of surety that they're going to produce an outcome that I can always work on and rely on. Security is the secondary aspect of that. And so really it's coming up with that third party risk management system, establishing what is the, minimal things you expect from a party when working with each other, and from there collaborate. There are third-party solutions coming into play. There's, security standards coming into play, depending on what vertical you're talking about these days, that are starting to impact that. But we're definitely seeing, that push across the board of really getting that, visibility, for both parties, and just having that level of assurity. So it's kind of a mixed bag of, which partner, which this with that. And really it's going to boil down to a business agreement. And then more importantly, just like every risk process, bringing it back to the executive board saying, hey, you really, really want this. So I need you to sign this because I can't guarantee it. My best example today is really contractual obligations between partners. I've seen a lot, especially during the holiday season. Partner A decides to extend their XYZ application and they become the MFA provider for a very large entity that's going to interact with that because they control the MFA implementation through whatever their single sign-on integration is. So haphazardly, they, in one example, they decided to work with a company that's 3 times their size. So in theory, they increased their attack surface, aka their users that could log in, by nearly, 40,000 new users. by the way they integrated this. And so, literally overnight, the SOC service got inundated when they flipped the switch, because now we're seeing all this shared SAML traffic and everything else. And can't necessarily guarantee that they weren't directly attacking this platform, but because we could see the SAML exchange, we now got visibility into how much they were getting attacked. I'm like, hey, a heads up. I'm the third party over here. A heads up would have been nice that you made this business decision. I know you're trying to be hush hush before you do your press release, but you just, crushed, your entire security organization by doing this integration. And I'm pretty sure the CISO didn't sign off on that.
Rick, do frameworks matter in that realm? Things like CMMC, NIST, CSF, like, do those really have the impact that we want to like improve vendor security and like accountability, like Jim was saying, beyond just financial impact?
CMMC, I'll kind of start with this one because it started and no one took it serious, and it was around for a while and got gaffed off, and even the government was like, we don't have enough people to audit, right? So you can't do that. I like the PCI DSS approach better, which is make sure people can assess the situation at the same time you're changing whatever the standards are. But what happened over 2025? So many clients, so many folks that are providing services either to governments, to the federal government. I've seen an up level in programs as a result, right? How they're handling secure data. You have a bunch of civilian organizations that have never been mandated by the government to handle something like classified information. Okay, great. Well, what does this mean? Hey, this all seems like, craziness handling secure information. And when you go, actually, you're providing for transport layer security via communications and email. You're making sure that it's restricted to the fewest number of people that need to see it. You've got some secure file. They go, oh, okay, well, wait a second. This doesn't sound that bad. And in fact, we have a lot of this that exists for our corporate organization. Okay, great. So then the answer becomes scope, out of scope. What are we going to scope this down to? All of those things. So I can tell you personally, I'm working on a ton of CMMC efforts. So I do think CMMC has a bit of teeth. NIST and the other frameworks, yeah. I mean, without having a mapping to those, I kind of don't have legs as a leader to go talk to my organization about doing third-party risk management, right? So that's a partnership you're probably going to have to, achieve with your financial team, your internal auditors, and your external auditors, those types of folks. But yeah, we still need to go justify why we do things. And I think it's easier when something exists in the framework than, hey, Rick McElroy says we need to worry about third-party risk management, when you can clearly go back to a compliance mandate or some sort of framework. And you said, hey, boss, remember we agreed we were going to build this program to go down the road of NIST? Well, great. Here's where we are. I give you regular checkpoints monthly and quarterly to do that. And one of those happens to be third-party risk management. That's an easier conversation than kind of just jumping the business in out of nowhere and saying, hey, there's probably a bunch of bad guys living all over everything we have connected. Like, it's like have a rational discussion with your business about that. Lastly, what I'll say to the leaders is this can clearly be attached to business objectives, especially in the case of CMMC. The answer to that is you are not going to get this contract if you don't have a process to do that. What are these future contracts worth to your business? This probably equals something we should spend money on and do. And I haven't heard those conversations take very long. They don't seem overly complex at that level. So the business understands what's at stake. They know that this is, table stakes to go get that business. Well, great. That's a conversation, we can participate in and help guide them through.
So it sounds like some actionable takeaways there are, first, you have to know what you're dealing with, who your vendors are, your first party, second party, third parties. I guess your third party would be your first party in that particular realm, but you need to understand who you're doing business with, what services they're providing you, what happens if they go down, and then implement on top of them some real vetting via things like, CMMC or one of these other frameworks. So with that, I think we have our last topic here, which is data exfil with legitimate tools. I can see Jim smiling there. So asset visibility is one of the biggest challenges we have today. And things like RMM tools are widespread. They're often deployed for convenience. Jim and I talked about PS exec a while back. That's an old favorite. Attackers are able to bypass things like MFA and, coerce users or again, fatigue them. Like, Rick, you had talked about fatiguing people makes them make mistakes. And so without having sort of a clear baseline of the tools and things in the organization, exfil becomes pretty easy for the third party. Jim, why do people use legitimate tools like that for attacks? And how can organizations know which is legit and which is not?
So yeah, again, much like Rick was doing as an industry, we've done a pretty good job. We've come up with new technologies to give us the visibility, and if we can see it, we can actually do something about it. So teasingly, remote management and monitoring tools have been an ecosystem, especially they ran rampant during the pandemic when it became a work from home scenario. And how do I support Bob or Sally as they work from home halfway from or on a beach in the Maldives, and take care of their laptop, make sure it gets patched and so forth. And so, during that time, the attackers got really good at attacking an organization, getting a implant, a web shell or just a straight up, interpreter, running on a exploited vulnerability and using that to load in their tools. Well, we see that. We know what to look, to the earlier point of we know what's not good. So once we start seeing that activity, we immediately start responding in the SOC. So our time to action got really, really quick. We could actually, jump on that. But what we saw the attackers immediately do is inherit some level of trust by starting to use commercially available tools. And, RMM is just the latest abused tool out there. Honestly, it doesn't matter who the vendor is, from Atera, who runs ads on the Super Bowl, to ConnectWise, to Kaseya. Every single one of them has been abused. I'd actually double down and give you some other stories out of that. But the first part of this is the bad guy just basically uses that platform to insert some level of inheritance or trust because it is a commercial tool. Now, the secondary tangent of that is in most cases they didn't buy it. They used the last victim they broke into, and they used their keys that they stole from the single sign-on attack they did to spin up their instance and oversubscribe their instance by 5,000%. So the dirty little secret in the industry today is a lot of vendors that are our SaaS providers don't necessarily gate how much you can install. So they don't have their own internal alerting systems to see an oversubscription. That was a byproduct from the last couple of years. I can tell you the new stats is no longer 5,000% oversubscribed at around 100 to 200%. They now actually start looking and seeing what's going on. But that was the running joke was, they would not attack you directly. They would attack your MSP provider or directly attack the ConnectWises, the Kaseyas and so forth of the world under your tenant, gain access and oversubscribe your tenant, and then start using that agent deployed everywhere. The other interesting side note is they don't use just one. So one of the things you'll see if you've ever gotten to see, over the shoulder from a SOC operation standpoint is the threat actors are using teaming. One team is specialized in this skill set, like maybe the exfiltration. This team is, specialized in compromising the domain. This team is specializing in dropping the ransomware inside the environment or going after backups and so forth. So teasingly, literally within the first hour or two, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these tools, and each one is associated with a different team and different activity going on. On the back end, they don't necessarily talk very well to each other. Some do, some don't. So you'll see them step on each other, drop the other guy's connection, or detonate the ransomware before the other guys are done, and you'll see them fighting and yelling at each other. It's kind of interesting on those notes. But yeah, it's basically that level of inheritance that this is a commercial tool and only commercial organizations use this. So maybe we can slip under the wire. To solve the problem, we've been doing it for a long time in our managed services, which is day one. We sit down with you. We go through all the list of tools you're supposed to have inside the environment, and we try to establish what normal is. And then we look for anomaly. We look for new things. And unfortunately, remote management and remote desktop tools is like whack-a-mole. Depending on who you work with and what third party you work with, you'll see someone simply use a GoToMeeting scenario, or install this meeting app that looks like a remote desktop because you can screen share, right? So we do have to kind of retrain, retool the organization on, let me know what you're going to use, because otherwise I'm going to start, pumping alerts at you. We're not going to have a high level of confidence. We want to actually get to the what is normal inside the organization. So some EDRs have been trained a little bit more better than others, but we all come down to policy enforcement. So in most cases, we do, we try to kill the ones that aren't accepted in the organization. But with that being said, it's really going to be on the business tolerance, because it is disruptive. If you start working with vendor X and vendor X uses one that's not on the approved list, you're going to have to make a policy change, just like the old firewall change management days. And so it is an awareness and education moment for the organization, much to the AI conversation, which is stop letting everybody install random stuff inside your environment if you want to quote unquote control or at least have the visibility you need to. But more importantly, establish the mechanism so you can measure, you can monitor, and then you can react. So,
yeah, it sounds like visibility gaps are the issue there, and just not knowing what's normal.
Yeah, I mean, we're using RMM as the example here, but even the other most common abused one is going to be backup applications. How many times have I seen compromises where the threat actor used a pirated copy of Veeam backup, dropped it into their Office 365 or, G Suite instance to do cloud to cloud backups and exfiltrate all of their, all their SharePoint and everything else in the organization at cloud speeds. So I've seen 4 terabytes leave in under an hour. And so that, they are using the inheritance of these corporate platforms to, facilitate just about every form of compromise they can, or, the attack chain they'll leverage. So buyer beware, be aware that these are tools. And more importantly, do you as an organization use these tools? Let us know, because we can see it. We can tell you, hey, you just installed a new Veeam, or OwnBack is another common one, because it works inside of Salesforce and SharePoint and some of the, or ServiceNow. So it's those type of enterprise, EDRs and, ERP platforms that are now compromised because of it. I broke in over here. I got my single sign on. I jumped into your other platform, figured out I was the admin inside of that. And now I'm able to pull down all of Salesforce and delete it on the way out. So, those are legitimate attacks. We're seeing time and time again, and they basically got in there and were able to facilitate the attack by just using a quote unquote known commercial tool.
Sure. Are there practical steps we can do, like to regain control, Rick, of these tools that have gone rogue within the organization?
Well, yeah. I mean, the simple answer is just listen to marketing and buy XDR, right? Yeah. I mean, I kind of could have sworn that there was a whole lot of companies a few years ago saying, oh, if I just bought their platform and gave them all this telemetry, we sure would lick this problem, right? But again, not to go back on a rant, Jim nailed it. There's a true issue, and it takes time in the seat. It takes time working with their telemetry to understand, again, that business context. Number one challenge for any third party you bring in. We have no idea what's happening with your business. The more information we can glean, the more you have information ready to consume from an external perspective, I think the faster that those recommendations, kind of take place, the faster strategies are developed, all of that stuff, right? And I know I was a little flippant up front, but no, look, you're still going to have to take, a defense in depth. You're still going to have to look at, zero trust. But mostly I would say, I think, again, for the teams out there, how are you cultivating your normal intelligence in a way that can be shared amongst external folks that are helping you, internal folks, and then growing that team? I think that's just a point area of focus for us, is that, wisdom management, and folks are starting to take a swing at this. You're seeing this, whether that's a chat bot that works with SecOps, whatever the case may be, right? But that's, I think, an area where I could see, given all the other projects that we're doing, it's always the one, like, historically that becomes our weak leg, is the exchange of this information. And I think there's, some great programmatic ways to start to look at that, especially if you are thinking through agentic approaches to build inside of your environment. There's some good ways to do, normal business exchange. This user always does this. Therefore, when I get an alert, I know it's probably the user, because that's just the way they work. I know that this user takes off work at 5:30 and shouldn't be seen again until 8 the next morning. Well, if I can note that as a SecOps team and somehow bring that into my triage, it just makes it better, right? So I think a little bit of focus around, that internal intelligence.
Actually, if I give you 2 takeaways on that note as well, which is, number one, if a new new management team comes in and they deploy another RMM tool, do yourself the honor and the favor of uninstalling the last one, please. As part of incident response, perfect timing on the swig there. Great. As part of my last 3 incident responses, it was the legacy platform that was no longer in vogue that was still left running inside the environment was the point of entry. And then number 2 is if you invested in a security stack, make sure it's installed on everything you quote unquote are accountable for. Literally in the past 4 months, 4 out of 5 IRs happened because of gaps in implementation. You bought the stuff. They just, for whatever reason, of the 2 tools that they had at their disposal inside the organization, they only installed one or the other. So there was a gap in expectation or visibility across the organization. So I could see the malware landing, but I couldn't tell you why, or vice versa in the scenario where I could see, authentication doing weird stuff, but I couldn't tell you what executable was running it. So it's that, those disparities, we have a 2 solution system here to give us all the visibility we can, you can hold us accountable for. So please install it on all the things that you're actually responsible for and, go from there. So.
Yeah, I think that goes back to Rick's talk about visibility and yours as well, where like you can't
asset management.
Yeah, you can't protect what you don't you can't see. It's always been the case. Well, I want to thank you both for your thoughts today and your wisdom. I think we've all kind of learned something out of this, that it seems like in 2025, nothing crazily new happened, but what we're seeing are the emergence, like we always do, of new threats, the expansion of AI, the lessening of the available staff to do that in-house, and the, things like AI outpacing governance and such like that. I guess, based on last year and this year, I'd love it if you could both give me a quick, recap of what you saw last year and how you're going to apply it this year.
Gabriel.
Yeah. Well, look, the first thing I'll tell anybody watching this is don't panic and bring a towel. We've been through massive disruptions, or at least I have. This is I think 4th major one that I can remember. And what changed as a result of the other ones? We needed some more controls. We needed to have better conversations with our organizations, and we needed better governance. So cool. We've got governance in. We've got some mechanisms with our leadership team to account for all of these things. Part of our job as the leaders of those security programs is to highly educate the folks that we work with. I don't expect them to be experts. However, I expect them to be able to have a reasonable conversation around the future. And so, look, we saw all kinds of noise. You're hearing, we've got malware that's now using AI that writes its own malware and figures out, new, novel methods. Well, guess what you're going to need to catch that? Telemetry. Guess what you're going to need to catch that? You're going to need to understand your business, normal. So from my perspective, other than speed and scale, nothing has changed. So I think on our side, the defensive side, we have to think about those 2 things. How do we quickly interrupt these new OODA loops that are going to be seen, and achieve that speed to market? And then how do we start to innovate to actually address some of these new areas that will be incurred from the business?
Yep. I will actually double click with you on that one, which is yes. But at the same time, the old foundational things still work. Asset management, and asset management. If you know where it is, you know what's going on, you're aware of it, and you can start accounting for it. So fundamentals still apply. So scale gives us a lot more to have to deal with. But at the same time, if you actually have a good core foundation of just knowing what you have, how it's being used, and from there, how can I protect it in real practical, applications, that'll go way further than just dealing with the sheer volume problem. But I can't discount we have a volume problem coming at us right now, and it's only getting bigger. So
fantastic. Well, I want to thank both of you for joining us today. This has been a really interesting conversation. I am Tim Armstrong. Our guests are Rick McElroy and Jim Broome. And we are from both DirectDefense and Nexasure. We encourage you to check out our information on our site and join us in a future webinar.
Yep. Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.